Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a Director's Vantage Point with Joel Ferrell.
Morning, y'all.
Yeah, hey, Joel. So this is presented by Dallas Summer Musicals Education and Community Partnerships Department. My name is Seth Johnson. I'm with the Education and Community Partnerships Department, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are so excited to have you all here for this masterclass. This is by far our largest virtual masterclass to date. It's very exciting. A few ground rules before we continue. Just please keep yourself muted throughout this conversation. When we are ready, about 15 minutes towards the end, we will have a Q&A where we will unmute you if you have a question. So definitely just let us know if you do have a question. We'll let you know who's going to be speaking, and then we'll take it from there. Throughout the discussion, if you have questions that pop up that you're like, ooh, I really need to write this down somewhere, put them in the chats, and we'll check that out, and we'll make sure that we answer those first when we get to the Q&A section. If you are a non-high schooler that is attending this meeting, welcome. You are more than welcome to be here. Just keep all of your questions within the chat window so that we can save the Q&A time for our wonderful high school students. So I don't want to waste any more of your time. I'm going to throw it over to Joel. Joel, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm overwhelmed that everybody wanted to be up at 10 a.m. in the morning, rocking and rolling, a discussion about directing in musical theater. Hey, so this is a big topic, bigger than I think I certainly realized when I was young, but it's also, I'm thrilled that you're all interested. I think no matter what you do in the world of theater, if you understand a director's perspective and sort of what the process is, you understand the whole organism a bit better, if that makes any sense. So I'm excited to chat with you about it. I want to leave plenty of room at the end for Q&A because I suspect everything I'm going to race you through will get us rolling on some Q&A later on. So I'm just going to hit it hard right here at the beginning. So we've got some, part of what I'm doing is including the process of sort of when you do this professionally, because there's getting the job and then managing it all the way through. So we've got some sort of bullet points that Seth is going to put up, and then we're going to sort of use those as the flow sheet. I think Devon is actually sharing with us now. And first and foremost, although I don't know that this necessarily applies to you guys right now, is get the job. And I just want to touch on this briefly because I don't know anything harder in the world of theater to understand than how you actually get directing jobs. It is a very make it up as you go sort of process. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. First of all, I think because unlike if you're an actor or a singer or a dancer, auditions come up, you can go audition. There's always the question of just how do you get rolling. So along with taking directing classes in school, one of the things that I always encourage is let everyone in your world know that you're interested in directing. Ask as often as you can if you can assist a director or trail a director or observe a director. The other thing that I think is really important when you're directing musical theater is that you school yourself in some version, shape, or form on musicals and on what and the music as the root. So the more understanding you have of music, if you read music, if you study as a musician, all of that stuff makes a huge difference. I came to it as a dancer, so I like to say I read music as a dancer. I read measures and time signatures and tempos better than I do notes. But all of that is a way into what is fundamentally an art form that has to begin and end with the music and with the composer and lyricist. But in terms of landing the job, what I wish I had known when I was younger was just to tell people more often that I'm interested in doing it. And one of the quickest and most glorious inroads into it is if you can direct theater for young audiences or children's theater, which so often is either musical or has a major musical component. It's an incredible way to get started and be able to test your abilities with young people for audiences that are very honest with you. If you've ever been a part of theater for young audiences, you'll know that if they're enjoying it, they will let you know. And if they're bored, wow, will they let you know. And really I have to say that theater for young audiences was the way I really discovered how I communicate to designers, how I sort of start the process, and ultimately it allowed me to experiment a lot with slightly less pressure, if that makes sense. So assuming someone gives us the gig of directing, the next thing I want to talk about is understanding the parameters. We can switch back to me if we want to. I think this may seem like the most vague version of it, but as we are learning now from a new breed of musical revivals, like the current Oklahoma on Broadway, musicals can be really tiny and really small. They can be enormous and very, very complex. So one of the things that I love to ask whoever has hired me, right, or whoever has been kind enough to give me the job is, I really need to understand the scope and parameters of this job. So the quickest way to know that is the budget. As fundamental as that sounds, it's sort of like, how much resources are there? How much time do we have? What is the caliber of the players involved, right? Am I talking about other students as designers and actors? Am I talking about highly skilled professionals? So that, and this I think is really important because it will keep you working your whole life. But a director has to think a little bit like a producer and a little bit like an actor on both ends of that, to sort of understand both the whole organism and then the specifics of it. So whenever I take on a job, the first thing I want to know is, how sort of large a scale did the person who hired me expect this to be? In other words, are we doing 35 actors on stage and multiple set locations? And is this big budget, or do I need to be really inventive about how to scale it down? So for instance, I did a Sweeney Todd recently in a basement theater with 9 actors total, which meant that from the moment we started conceiving it, because we were also on limited time, it had to be something where the design didn't slow us down, it didn't get in our way. We had to be able to be flexible. I needed actors who could play instruments. For me, it also meant making sure that all of the actors were skilled musicians in terms of reading music, so that they could get a lot of homework done on their own, et cetera. So sort of knowing budget size, who's going to be involved, what the expectations are when it all ends. This sounds very businessy. So let's get on to the next fun part. So now I'm going to skip to one of my favorite things about all of this, which is homework, I believe is what's next. Seth, does that sound right? And Devon? Yeah, good. So what I mean by homework is a bunch of things, and they're all incredibly fun to me, right? And one of them is, if this is an existing piece of musical theater, learn everything you can about it. And that starts with the composer and lyricist, right? So one of the things I don't think I really understood early enough was how much great information I could glean by, why did the composer and lyricist decide to fall in love with this story? If it's an old story or myth that has existed, why did they come back to it? If it's a brand new story, what was the source material? Was it a novel? Was it a movie? What made them fall in love with that story? And then where did they come from, right? If the composer and lyricist is one person, or whether they're 2 or 3 people, what is their background, right? Literally, where were they raised? How did they get turned on to musical theater? What was their way in? All of it sounds like it wouldn't be informative, but I promise you it will help you in enormous ways. And then there's all that good standard stuff that you would do in a play. What's the time period? What's the sensibility? What's the socio-political environment around this? What audience am I doing this for? Are they going to, if I go sort of high concept with it, are they going to get it, etc.? But there is no amount of homework that is too much. So to that end, I often say too, if you're lucky enough to have an assistant or an associate director or someone on the team who can help be a dramaturg, so that you can hand off some of the things like, hey, would you go find out everything for me about the time period, the where we are in history, what's going on, what would be the realities of the daily lives of these people, et cetera, et cetera. If you can dispatch someone else to find out all about sort of the musical tone of this. Why did Sondheim decide to write all of Little Night Music in waltz tempo? The entire musical is in waltz tempo. It's like, was he just on crack cocaine? He just liked a big challenge. What exactly was going on there? And in investigating all of that, you find both the things that are going to be your biggest challenges and your best friends. I think when I was young, I thought, ooh, directing is this very singular thing, right? You're the leader at the top, and you decide everything and then impart that information. And what I've learned, much to my joy, is that it is the greatest team sport ever. So in doing the homework, you want to be keeping your stage manager filled in on everything you're doing. You want to keep your team filled in on everything you do. And if you gather the team, or if this is some of what you're doing alone, turn to people who are even more informed or smarter. When I did a production of Cabaret a few years ago, I partnered with the Dallas Holocaust Museum. And suddenly I had access to this incredible amount of information. And conceptually, the ending of the production completely changed as a result of that. Like what visually the audience experienced and saw came very specifically from days, wonderful hours of gracious people at the Holocaust Museum talking to me about some of the realities of the later stages of the Holocaust. Sounds very depressing. Honestly, it was incredibly informative. And those moments will continue to inform you your whole life as a director. So there's all this fun stuff you get to do on your own before then you bring it to a team of people and sound incredibly smart. So sometimes I say, if for no other reason, make sure that if you think of questions that designers and actors are going to ask you, that you've at least got an answer or a source, right? Like, this is great that you asked me that. I have a friend at the blah, blah, blah museum, or a friend at the X library that will help us out on that. All right, I'm going to go to the next bullet point, which I believe is gather the team, correct? Okay, so this is a biggie, and this is a fun one for me. For me, the team that becomes really, really important on a musical, it's a big team, bigger than I think people realize. It involves the stage management team, because musicals by their nature are more complex. There's more things going on. They're harder for stage managers to call. So working closely with your stage management team will save everyone. The more they know, the more you download information to them and use them as a collaborator, truly. Because if you think of a big musical, right? Think of any of the big shows on Broadway right now. Mean Girls, let's choose Mean Girls. Very fun show. Doesn't look, when you watch it, that complex, but there are probably 700 costume changes. There are probably 400 wig changes. There are multiple complex sets. It is a giant machine backstage. And that team of people, you have to allow them to say to you, hey, you have to make that piece of choreography a little longer because we're not making the costume changes. In other words, I often say, the best way to understand eventually how to direct a musical is to be an actor in a musical as much as you can when you're young, because that way you understand what the giant machine is backstage and everything that has to happen, because it's a massive operation. The other thing that is, let's face it, incredibly fun is the design team, right? So I think when I was young, I was just so happy I had a design team that I didn't necessarily sort of curate that in the way that ultimately I've been fortunate enough to when I got older and a little more experience. So a part of that for me is really understanding those designers. Almost all designers have a web page now that you can go to and see their work and get a sense of their sensibilities, or see a piece of their writing about how they approach design. One of the things I like to say is, I love it. My go-to is two designers that I've worked with many times and two designers that I have not worked with. Because over your career, you want to be adding to the pool of people and the team of incredible people that you work with. You want them to be diverse. You want them to come from different backgrounds. You want them to come from different countries if you can. One of my favorite collaborators is a Chinese American named Yi Zhao, and he grew up to age 13 in China. He grew up from 13 to college age in Paris. He went to school in the US and he now lives in Berlin. And what I often find is that he has ideas and thoughts architecturally. He's a lighting designer, but there are so many things that he brings to me because frankly, he's just lived in greater cultural diversity. And so I'm always sort of going, hey, E, I'm gonna turn to you first because I sort of want to hear your ideas about what's going on. So as you gather that team, I think we all often feel the time pressure of, hey, we have to get this big musical up. So let's immediately just start talking about practical stuff. Are we going to have doors? Are we going to have, we're going to have big pieces of scenery or little pieces of scenery? I encourage you as much as you can in your life with your design team to not start with the super practical, to start with the poetic, to start by trying to say in a paragraph what you feel like the sort of fundamental takeaway from the show is. This show investigates man's inhumanity to man, or this show investigates how disconnected we are as human beings during the Industrial Revolution, right? When you think about something like Les Mis, right? This is a sweeping story all during the French Revolution. And I mean, you could study for days and not know everything you want to know about the French Revolution. But Victor Hugo did that for you. So in the conversations about that, I would start with the designers by saying, let's look at the art of the period. Let's look at what the painters were doing. Let's look at what the musicians were doing. Let's read what the philosophers were saying, because every period of time is a tumultuous period of time to some degree. That's the good news for theater people. There's always controversy in the world, which means there's always drama in the world, which means there's always something to put on stage. And so, I think good writers write about high conflict and when humans are challenged the most in their lives, so that the conflict is big. There's great potential for drama, great potential for human pathos. And so one of the things I love to do with the designers, whether I'm talking to the set designer, the lighting designer, the costume designer, is, hey, send me images of paintings, architecture, send me snippets of music, send me things that just make you viscerally think of the conflict we're talking about. It can be modern art, it can be ancient art, but really what you want is to sort of stockpile a poetic way of talking about the imagery in the show, and sort of where you want big moments to land and what you want an audience to feel and take away. Because I think because musical theater originally grew, what we know as American musical theater grew out of European operetta, we forget that there's also all of these other things to draw on, right? I mean, there's Asian art and culture, there's South American art and culture. There's all these amazing things that began really in the melting pot of the United States, art forms that are specifically ours, like jazz, right? And ragtime, and incredible music forms. We sort of invented musical theater as we know it today, right? I mean, it grew out of a bunch of different ideas, but we sort of honed it into this thing where it's like, we'll use any version of American music or anybody else's music that we want to use to do it. So you really want a lot of influence that then you can sort of sift down into, oh, here's a jumping off place for us, right? All right, I'm going to go to the next slide, which I'm assuming is auditions, even though I'm not looking. Okay, so now here's the next big step. I'm going to try to make this concise. In American theater, because we have limitations on time and resources, we don't start including the actors until we've already started our process. So what I mean by that is the actors are sort of the last group of amazing collaborators to come to the process, which is not the way I would do it if the world were perfect. If the world were perfect, I would gather the actors at the same moment I'm gathering the designers and the stage managers, so that I allowed them as much access and as much input as possible. So in a weird way, the auditions are where that begins. So a couple of things. Obviously, there's some fundamental things actors for musical theater have to be able to do. Ideally, they have to be able to sing well. You want talented singers, you want talented dancers, you want talented actors. But I think the mistake that we make sometimes is leaning too heavily on auditions as a job interview, as you have to pass my test. I encourage you to think of it as sort of just the opposite. I encourage you to think of it as almost a rehearsal. In other words, it's two potential collaborators meeting, right? I've got inventive ideas, you've got inventive ideas. I'm going to try to communicate some of my ideas, and then I want to know about yours as well. Because what you ultimately want on your team is people who are nimble, incredibly smart, really, really brave. Right? You don't want them to beat up on themselves too fast or be too shy, because especially if you're trying to invent something remarkable and new, whether that's reinvestigating an old musical, or if you're really lucky, get to do a brand new musical where it's like, hey, we're making this out of thin air. We need the smartest people in the room. So what I frequently say to actors is, if you are the kind of actor who beats up on yourself too easily, like you think everything is a test and you're worried about failing it, I need you to think, I'm likely not to hire you. I'm likely to hire actors who think of themselves as fully rounded theater artists who have strong opinions, who will discuss and argue those opinions with me and with the choreographer and with the musical director, not because you want it to be a difficult process. You want it to be a robust process, right? I think we don't realize how much actors shape a show. But if you're lucky enough to get an incredible team of actors, they will teach you the show. So one of the things that's great about auditions, think about this, when I'm lucky and direct a musical and go both to New York to cast it or in Dallas, wherever, sometimes multiple cities, I'm gonna hear upwards of 500 people, sometimes as many as 700, read text from this script, sing songs from this script, do choreography from this show. Literally, that is like a master class for me, because the more different great actors I hear these words come out of, the more I go, oh my gosh, it's revealing new, incredible things to me. So the more time you can spend with an actor in an audition process, the more they're likely to get more comfortable with you and win the day, right? And win the job. But part of it is putting them at ease. So one of the things I learned from British directors a long time ago is meet them not as a potential employer, but as a future collaborator. So when they come in the room, if you can, stand up, shake their hand, ask them how their day is going, right? In other words, try to make it a human to human reality, because ultimately that's what collaboration is, right? We got to drop the walls, drop the barriers, stop the worry about whether we're meeting the test and making somebody happy, and just be able to bring our full artistic self to the process. And the director is the one that sets the tone for that. You are the one that has to say, this is going to be a safe, friendly, inventive, exciting room. And there are times where I'll have to make the final decision on if we get to choose A, B, or C. I'm going to have to guide that, but I want all of those options in front of me. You can ask me more about that later, but I love auditions. They are typically where I get the most excited about the show, because I can see the players that are going to be helping me create it all. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. Help me remember what it is. It's like, oh,
Rehearsals.
thank you. Auditions, rehearsals. Oh gosh, rehearsals, right? Most of us feel like that's where everything starts. I'm like, you want to have done so much homework, know so much, have learned so much, talk to so many people, including the cast if you can, even before you start rehearsals. I usually send out a pretty involved 1 or 2 page letter to the cast before we start rehearsals that just says, here's the process I've been through thinking about this show. Here's the homework I've done. Here's the authors I've read. Here's what I've learned about the playwright, the composer, the lyricist. Here's the design team and how we gathered them, and here's their information, so you can go look at their websites, etc. And on the first day of rehearsal, I always like to do meet and greet, right? I mean, this is probably not a foreign thing. You finally got everybody. You get in a big room. It's very exciting, but a lot of people are very new to each other. The cast may not have met each other, right? Actors might not have met the choreographer, etc. So I think you want that to be as robust a celebration of, oh, good, we're finally all here. Let's learn about each other and let's talk about this thing that we're going to do. So I always say, try to indulge the meet and greet a bit. Let them in on your process. Let them in on the question marks that you still have about the show. What is still worrying you about how to bring this to life? Let everybody know that you're gonna really need everyone to bring their A game and 100% of their smarts, their brain power, their energy into the room, and their patience, because it is a very hard process, right? And it starts with the music. So one of the things that I think is often frustrating for a director, but it's just true, is that you want a really skilled musical director with you, right? And for the first few days of a musical, typically you need to sort of turn over the music, turn over the rehearsal to the musical director, and really let them drive and teach the cast the music of the show, investigate it, get down into the nitty-gritty of it. The more the cast understands that score, including incidental music and underscoring and all of that, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Because not in a good piece of musical theater, nothing is arbitrary. Not the overture, not the underscoring, not even the incidental scene change music. It all can continue to help you tell the story, and it can all be a part of what helps you invent the process. So everybody has to learn the music, and then you have to start doing what we call the divide and conquer, right? It's like the dancers are going to go with the choreographer and learn some choreography. Certain ensemble members are going to stay with the musical director. Some of the actors are going to come to the director to sort of begin to do some table work, talk about how we're going to approach some of these scenes. And then there's this great puzzle that the stage managers have to help you with, which is, oh, I want to work on this scene. It involves a song. I want the musical director and I to be together for that. Oh, we're going to work on this shift and this idea of passage of time. I need the choreographer with me. So typically on a new musical, you would have a choreographer and an assistant choreographer. You'd have a musical supervisor who's taking care of all ideas of the music, including how the show is ultimately orchestrated. You'd have a musical director who's handling, having the cast understand it all. You might have a dance orchestrator. You might have a vocal arranger. You've got your stage management team. You might have a dramaturg with you. I mean, often when I do a new musical, it's like there are 100 people. What are we doing? The 10 Commandments, the movie. I mean, it can feel massive, but that's one of the things that I think is most challenging for young directors, is that you have to feel confident gathering the smartest people you can possibly gather and not get worried about whether you're the smartest person in the room. Because when it comes to musical detail, there will be someone smarter than you. When it comes to choreography, there will be someone smarter than you. That's a good thing, right? Your leadership is not about being the only one that knows everything, or even the one that knows more than everyone else. It's having done your homework and communicated your ideas of texture and theme and what we want an audience to understand and take away from this so well that your team can get a lot of that work done for you and with you, and then you can mold it and shape it. Yes? All right, I'm gonna keep trucking here for a minute. Next would be tech and previews. Now listen, I know previews is probably a thing that is a luxury that happens in the professional world, but I'm still gonna include it just to talk about what that is. So the tech rehearsal, when you finally get into the theater and all the designers are there and all the technicians are there and the dressers and the wardrobe people, that can seem overwhelming. So I wanna encourage you that for a director, that is where your leadership kicks into a whole different higher gear. And because there are so many people involved and you're adding new elements and you're beginning to add costumes and complicated scenery pieces, it's you have to take a deep breath, a big old deep breath, and put a smile on your face and think, when I first imagined getting to direct, this was the juicy, gooey, glorious bit I was excited about, right? This was the moment where all of the elements come together, and it can be a very tedious process, right? It requires an unbelievable level of patience. And what it requires from you is to be able to keep your eye on the big picture, right? So if there's somebody that's worried about, we're never going to make that costume change, we still don't have the notes right on that thing, the choreography looks sloppy, and we can't do what we wanted to because there's a set piece in the way, right? That you have to just keep calmly problem solving. What's the most important thing? What's the next most important thing? And what's the thing that can wait, right? And now I'm going to tell you that this is what it took me a while to learn, and it's a little graphic, so forgive me. But this is also where I say you have to be the best leader in the room in terms of being willing to drown some of your precious kittens. And I know that's a horribly graphic way to say it, and I'm a pet lover, so forgive me. But what I mean by that is you have to be willing to throw away something that you thought was the most precious thing, right? Some moment that from the moment you started thinking about the show, you were like, there's going to be this moment in the show where this thing happens and it's the greatest thing and I'm brilliant for thinking of it. And what you discover when you get to tech is that some of the things that you thought were the most important things may not be. They may ultimately not be as important as you thought they were, right? Or they may be hindering something else you've discovered that is really good and that is fundamentally just telling the story better. So one of the things you have to do, and one of the things you have to encourage everyone else to do, is what did we think 3 weeks ago was really important that we have now discovered isn't that big a deal, right? Because the most important thing, the audience doesn't know what you got rid of. The audience only knows the thing you deliver to them, right? And they assume that that thing magically came out of you because you're brilliant and a magician. And that's great. That's what we want them to think, yeah? When in fact, it's a very sort of surgical process to figure out what you're going to include, what you're going to throw away. And sometimes that means saying to the choreographer, I don't think that dance number needs to be as long, right? Or I think it's overly complicated, or it's not focused and therefore we're losing the actual story we need to tell. Or you might need to turn to the musical director and orchestrator and say, I think the orchestration is too heavy during this point. We've included all the bells and whistles and we need simplicity because we've been hearing complex orchestration for 20 minutes now, right? So it can mean everything right down to, hey, I think we better change that wig because there's too much hair in the actor's face and the audience can't see them. I mean, it can be everything. But within that, you got to make time for the actors, right? So what happens is we get all involved in the tech and we get all excited about all the scene changes and we forget to go backstage and touch base with those actors and say, hey, I know this is a big process and it can feel sometimes like we're worried about all the lights and the sound and the bells and whistles and not what you are communicating on stage. But what we're trying to do is create the container that will give you the greatest potential for telling this story. So it's going to get tedious at moments, it's going to get frustrating, but we will continue to weed it sort of out of your way, right? So that we can get back to the story that we were telling when we were in the rehearsal studio. And then previews, if you're lucky enough to have them, are where you get to put the show in front of an audience, take notes, and then come back during the day, the next day, and rehearse, change things, right? Now, this is not a luxury that came to me until I had been directing for about 20 years. So it was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? This is almost too good to be true. And what I quickly learned was it sort of depends on whether you have 2 weeks of previews, like Broadway shows have a month, sometimes a month and a half of previews, right? Now, 2 things. One is that's amazing because you can change massive things. You can add whole numbers. You can rewrite a number. You can change a whole set of costumes. but it is very taxing, right? It's a relentless process because you're rehearsing from noon to 5, you're taking a dinner break, the actors are coming back and performing a 3-hour show, you're giving them notes, they're trying to go sleep really fast and rest up and take care of themselves and come back and do it all over again. So a part of all of this, I think, is a sense from the director that in the perfect world, you're not trying to wear everyone out. You're actually trying to keep them healthy and functioning so that by the time you get to opening, you have a happy, amazing team of people making an audience happy every night. And that is a big task. So I often say directing a 4-character play on a unit set is sort of like driving a speedboat. It's really fun. You got to be careful, right? I mean, you don't want to get too dangerous and kill everybody. But basically, you can learn to do it pretty quickly, and it's really fun. Directing a musical, a large-scale musical, is like being the captain of a massive cruise ship. You can't know what's going on every deck at every moment. So you have to have a really, really smart team. You have to trust them as much as they trust you. You have to really be good about communicating what's going on the poetic level and on the practical level. And then you've got to let that team do their work so that you can have a fantastic cruise to the Bahamas. Because it's big. It's really exciting. And that's why I say anytime you can trail someone, assist someone, every aspect of it you can learn. If you've never done any stage managing, but you can do some stage managing on a musical, do it. You will learn so much. There are some really wonderful directors working on Broadway who were never actors, they were never singers, and they were never stage managers. And frankly, they're very talented, but I often find that they have a hard time being able to communicate to their whole team and trust everyone well. And they have a hard time caretaking their team and their troops because they sort of want what they want and they've never quite bothered to stop and understand how complicated it is in coming together, if that makes sense. So thank you for listening to me. It feels very weird that you all have been muted this whole time. So now I'm going to open it up to some questions. I know I've hurled you through a bunch of stuff. There is no dumb question, I promise you. And I will answer anything. So unmute yourselves and Seth will guide you through some questions. So hit me.
So actually our first question comes from Jordan. And the question is, as a stage manager looking into directing soon, how do you think technicians will be enveloped into the theater world since no one in the fine arts is really working right now?
Wow, that's a great question.
I would love to know the answer to that too.
That's one of those where if I had the answer, the nation would be calling me. But I do think this is true. I think what we've discovered through thousands of years of doing theater is that it ultimately can't be done without a bunch of really, really smart humans. And so, for instance, the Dallas Theater Center has just commissioned 3 local playwrights to direct Zoom plays. So they are 20-minute plays created to be performed on the Zoom platform. And they have hired directors, they've hired designers, they've hired stage managers. Because in a sense, you still need all of those people to make that thing, right? It might seem simple. It's not simple if you want it to be well lit or carefully designed. You're always going to need smart folks. I don't know, Jordan, if that exactly answers your question, but I do like the fact that, good stage managers always are very caretaking of the art, but they also are deeply embedded in the practical issues that have to be solved in order to make something great happen on stage. And my whole life, I've continued to learn how valuable that is. But I don't think ultimately we're going to lose the need for technicians and technical artists. I think it's going to mutate. I think, frankly, this period of time that is incredibly difficult for the arts is going to explode some conversations about making theater that we've been needing to have for a good while, right? Because the world is changing technologically, as it did with the industrial age, as it did with computers. And everybody was like, oh, we're not going to need people anymore. We got computers. And I'm like, yeah, no. That is not true. You still have to have smart people to design it all.
All right, Joel. So our next question is from Tabitha, and they ask, how much time would you say you have to complete one show on average?
Wow. Okay. Well, so Tabitha, one of the things that is, let's see if I can make this fast. So when regional American musical theater got started in the 40s and 50s, basically what happened was musicals are just more expensive to do. Musicals in the old school way, like if you think of Oklahoma or Carousel or even the major big Broadway shows, there's more people, there's more elements, they need more time. So a Broadway show usually rehearses from 6 to 8 weeks, then it techs for about 2 to 3 weeks, then it previews for a month or a month and a half, and finally it opens. And at the point it starts rehearsals, people have been working on the show for 2 or 3 years, like minimum. So it's a really, really long process. I think what happened when we started doing theater out in the regions was, I don't know, have you guys ever heard the term summer stock? Okay, so what summer stock meant was, hey, we're going to find a venue and we're going to gather a bunch of young performers and teach them the show at lightning speed. But the principals we're going to bring in from New York, and they will be people that have done the show before and know it cold and, are understudied the original Broadway leads. So we can sort of speed up the process, right? And I think, listen, I got my equity card doing summer stock and I loved every minute of it. But you don't really get to do the show. You don't get to investigate it fully. You're really just trying to get it on its feet, and you're mimicking something that has come before, right? You're right. You've gone to New York and seen the Broadway production and taken a bunch of notes, and you're like, okay, let's just make it look like that, right? But I think more and more what we've realized is that is not only a little unfair because you're taking someone else's intellectual property, you're taking what someone else actually created and sort of stealing it, and doing the sort of truncated version of it. So what I like to say is that you can do a show, you can do a musical in 3 weeks, but that means the amount of homework has to be sort of extraordinary. You have to be so ready to rock and roll when the moment comes. And then it becomes about time management. And this is where your stage management team becomes your lifeline. At some point you literally have to break down the process and say, if we've got 2 weeks or 3 weeks and we have this many scenes and this many musical numbers, we literally have to schedule this within an inch of its life every day. So for this hour, these actors are doing this, these actors are doing this, these actors are costume fittings, and so it really, as silly as it sounds, directors need to be sort of right and left brain balanced. If that makes sense to you, somehow you have to really keep an eye on the super practical, where are we getting this done quickly enough? Can we make it to the finish line? And then at the same time, be able to make space with the actors and the creators to get the work done, to feel like you've answered the questions that they need answered to be able to give a rich performance. And that is really challenging when you have time constraint. But I believe I have done it. I believe it can be done, but I think we'll always be fighting for more time. It's just time is money. There are producers on the call with us, and they will tell you, you add a week to rehearsals of professional actors and musicians and dancers, and the budget just went way, 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 way up. So a part of our sometimes re-envisioning musicals with smaller casts or with actor musicians or with a unit set that doesn't have as many moving parts is a way to bring these stories back to life without having to spending the money strategically to let the actors and audience have intimacy as opposed to letting it be grand and spectacular.
Awesome. So we have a lot of really great questions pouring in through the chat window. Keep them coming. If we don't have time to finish all of the questions here, we will definitely take time to send you a personalized email with the answers to here.
Absolutely.
Our next question comes from Brenna. Brenna, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Make sure you unmute yourself too.
Yeah, I think I did.
Oh, great. I can hear you.
So my question was, how would I or any other young writer find someone to look into our scripts or compositions in hopes of it being produced or critiqued or edited?
Oh, that is such a good question, Emma. So I'm going to tie this back to directing. Ready? I think that one of the smartest things young writers can do is get themselves attached to a young director. I mean this genuinely, because getting scripts in front of people is as hard as figuring out how to get directors' jobs, right? Because once you have some success and get published, people come to you, and want to talk. But before that, it's a little hard to get them done. So I think one of the things is what I have seen around the nation really successful, and I think this can start as early as high school, but I think it really, really kicks in college. If you're in a good theater program in college and you're a writer, get yourself attached to a young director who you feel like understands you, gets your voice, right? Because playwriting is not meant to be read, it's meant to be heard and experienced and understood, ideally, right? So one of the things that you just got to find a way to do is get actors on their feet live doing some of your dialogue, right? And so the great thing about college is every theater program makes bandwidth available for like student productions, right? Or student directed productions or student written productions or even student produced productions. And so that is, I often say that college, high school too, especially if you go to a performing arts high school, but college is where you start to build a repertory company. That is where you start to gather a team of people that with any luck, you will know your whole life, and you will count on them to be that person who knew you when all of you were young and trying to make a name for yourself. So for instance, Neil LaBute, for instance, in college, he started writing, found a specific actor and a specific young director that really understood him. And one of the ways that he found success was they would just put up small productions, right? Or put up pieces of his plays as sort of a backers audition, if that term makes any sense to you. But that's basically when you do a portion of something pretty stripped down in order to get people interested in it. So there's no one way to go about it, right? But I think sending your plays to as many people as possible. But the thing that really ultimately usually gets someone excited is to see it on its feet, right? Is to take it off the page and onto. And in this day and age, you can video that. You can do a Zoom presentation. I mean, there are 100 ways around that now that were not available to us a long time ago. Utilize all of it. Utilize every version of that you can think of to get it in the mouths of actors, preferably good actors. But Sam Hunter, Teresa Reba, I mean, I can think of all these playwrights that really part of their launch was having a couple of really smart colleagues who were directors and actors who understood them. A lot of that early Steppenwolf material, a lot of the early stuff Tracy Letts wrote, he was writing specifically for Laurie Metcalf and Gary Sinise and John Malkovich because he knew their strength, right? I mean, he knew what they were good at. He was like, great, let's do something that will bring this material to life. So, you can write only from your own imagination, but you can also write by going, hey, I really think these two actors are spectacular and this is what they do best. I'm going to write to their skills, right? So there's 100 ways to go about it. So keep thinking. You need collaborators. Writing is a very lonely art form, but the minute you can bring other people, other colleagues into the conversation with you, the closer you're going to get to getting it on its feet and in the mouths of actors, because that's what we want, right? I mean, that's the goal. Cool.
These are really great questions, y'all. Our next one will come from Toby. Toby, do you want to ask your question?
Toby, I can't. Oh, there you go. Now I got you.
So how would you create the show in your own ambiguity without making it look like it's been copyrighted or redone or even created over again?
Toby, there is the billion-dollar question, man. So now I'm going to go to, I don't know if you guys read Once on This Island, But one of the things I always encourage people to do when they're a young director is pick a piece of musical theater that is sort of mythical or sort of a storytelling piece, so that it really can be envisioned and designed and created in a bunch of different ways. So one of the things, Toby, that I always try to do, if someone hires me for a show, instead of going to look at a video of the way the show's been done before, I do not do that. This takes some confidence, so be brave, but listening to the music, absolutely, right? You want to get your hands on the music, and you want to get your hands on the music in as many forms as possible. And you want to do a bunch of homework about who this composer and lyricist are. And in fact, if they are still living, or if any of their children are living, you can email them. You'd be surprised how many people will write back to you and talk to you about this baby of theirs that they helped create. I think it is, I don't think, and we feel like we need to reference what came originally, when in fact, what came originally was just out of someone's imagination, right? So if there are realistic settings, then you have to create those, but sometimes even realistic settings can be done in an abstract way. So I have put a couple of pictures up, Devon has put a couple of pictures up of the original company of Once on This Island. And if you notice, this was in a proscenium, big Broadway theater. And as you notice, there's almost no scenery. And the costumes that you see these actors in, those are, I mean, they basically had a base costume, and anything else they just added to it. And they added masks. So what Graciela Danielle did, who was the original director choreographer, and someone I encourage you to learn about, because she is one of the greatest musical theater director choreographers I know of, and yet she's not really a household name. She was the original, she did the original stage movement and choreography for Ragtime, a billion shows, but she's quite remarkable. And she loves sort of allegorical pieces and pieces that don't have to live in a sort of rigid, realistic reality. So her concept was that the whole thing would be created with the actors, very little set, very little set pieces, very little props, and that it would be extraordinarily movement-based. If you know the opening number of Once on This Island, it's called We Dance. So even though the show was full of people who don't consider themselves dancers primarily, the whole show just moved and moved and moved. I mean, it felt almost as much like a sort of cool movement dance concert than it did. And now I'm going to have Devon switch to, this was the Broadway revival. And if you look at a couple of those pictures, you see not only that it's sort of a sandy beach, this was in the round, although there were some vertical things as well, but it was an incredibly cluttered production. And the reason was that Michael Arden, who was the director that re-envisioned the Broadway, decided, he was coming to the piece after we'd had these unbelievable hurricanes, you're right, Katrina in New Orleans, the horrible hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. And so his idea, given that the story is supposed to be told by peasants after a storm, was, let's put them in that reality. Let's put them in the reality where everything has been blown to smithereens and destroyed. Houses have been destroyed, debris is everywhere, and people have to sort of create this story to calm themselves, to remind themselves that their ancestors, that people before us have lived through tragedy. People, our children and children's children will live through tragedy. And part of the way we get through that in the world is that we keep telling our story, right? We keep telling stories of strength and of triumph and of human connection, so that we can keep going in times of difficulty. And I think one of the things that I find most miraculous about American musical theater is, we think a lot of times, it grew out of musical comedy, right? Sort of fluffy shows with silly songs. And that was a part of its history in vaudeville and burlesque and operetta. But what started to happen with Rodgers and Hammerstein and Jerome Kern, and then ultimately all the writers we know and love today, is that they were like, look, this doesn't have to be a silly art form. This can be a serious art form. It can take on as many topics. It can take on difficult topics. So, before too long, you had Cabaret and Sweeney Todd and Ragtime. And you had these shows that were taking on really complicated and difficult issues. And there was great humor and there was great love and joy in them, but there was also great tragedy. And I mean, gosh, Les Mis is hardly a perky musical, right? Even though we love it and it's great fun to do. But even back with R&H, I mean, they started taking on bigotry, et cetera. So I think part of it is, I saw a production of South Pacific once that there was never anything literal scenically. It was all sort of fragments of World War II, because, you know, World War II was a sort of global catastrophe. So there's so many ways to approach it. And I think this, Toby, comes to gathering a team, right? So when you take the thing on as soon as you can, find somebody who loves doing research, if you don't yourself love doing research, and try to find your designers and just start talking about what the, you know, with something like Once on This Island, do you want to set it in a mythical world? Do you want to be realistic with it? Do you want to put it in the here and now, or do you want to place it 200 years ago, right? Because ultimately, this was a piece that Ahrens and Flaherty found this gorgeous book that was written by a woman in the Antilles that was sort of a retelling of The Little Mermaid, except instead of the Disney version where everything turns out okay, she was telling a more realistic version, and one that is more true to the original myth, which is, it's, you know, it may not work out perfectly for this generation, but the more our generation tries to push to rid ourselves of bigotry or dissent or separation between human beings, the more the next generation will prosper. Does that make sense? So often, if you can find the sort of big universal themes, a wonderful director who I revere named Liesl Tommy, woman of color, originally from South Africa. She just directed the Aretha movie that's set to come out in a few months, sometime this year. She directed a production of Les Mis for us at the Dallas Theater Center when I was there. And she set it in a pre-apartheid sort of South African modern world. And it took a lot of negotiation to get Cameron McIntosh, the original producer, to let us do this. But it turned out to be enormously successful. And I think it's because it asked an audience to hear the story and see the story in a new way. Now, I'm not saying that's any better or any worse than setting it in France, but it made, I think for young people, it made the intricacy of the conflict in Les Mis, it made more sense, because it was like, oh, now I understand what class of person that person is, or where that, how that person came to be, how they're connected to another person. But most importantly, it was just Liesl being able to communicate to her designers and to the actors how we were going to do this, and with a high level of trust, so that everyone would get on board and instead of people being like, I don't think this is going to work, I just want to wear a French costume. It was a team full of people who were like, we can make this work, but it means we're going to have to be smart. We're going to have to answer a lot of questions, solve a lot of issues in order to make the story clear for the audience. And one of the things that I think is the most exciting thing for a director is your job is to get an incredible story told to an audience that will move them and alter their consciousness. I always say, if someone comes to me, and this, I'm happy to say, happens on occasion, somebody comes to me and says, I saw the production you directed of blah, blah, blah 10 years ago, and there were these moments, and then they describe these moments to me, right? And they're like, I've never stopped thinking about that. It's haunted me. It's come back time and time again. And I thought of it when I read this book, and I thought of it when this political moment happened. Of course, that is the most exciting thing I can imagine, because it stayed with them, right? That it changed their consciousness enough that it carried them. It stayed with them as a great memory. And, what we do is very ephemeral. It happens for a month and it goes away. So what we're trying to do is get people to connect it to the rest of the world, right? Sort of how they view the world. So the way you decide to end a production of Cabaret, the way you and the team decide to end a production of Les Mis, or even of Grease, can stay with somebody for a long time. So what is the way that the story has never been told? What are the design elements that would be a surprise or help someone see it in a new way? So there are times where designers bring ideas to me where my first reaction is, oh my God, I never thought of that in my life. I'm not sure. And then I really try to investigate, like, what made you think of this? What made this come to mind? What's the imagery that you looked at, or what was the weird nightmare you had that made you think of these ideas? And then we really try to drill down. And what we usually come up with is sort of a hybrid of the sort of ideas that poetically came to the design and choreographer and musical director's brain. So I will stop there, but I'll be glad to expand on that, Toby, at another time. But I think, our job ultimately as a director is always to take the script and the music of a musical and start fresh, right? And whether you're doing it in the round or proscenium or thrust, or you're doing it in a small space, a large space, is the audience likely to already know the show really well, right? One of the reasons it's fun to direct Shakespeare or even musical versions of Shakespeare is so many people already know the basic plot, right? It's like, you basically know Romeo and Juliet. You may not know it intimately, but you basically get it. So, are you doing a musical where the audience already knows a good bit of what may happen, and your job is to create surprises for them or get them to hear it in a new way? Or is it a dense and complicated story that they've never heard before? And therefore, the most important thing is get them the story without cluttering it so much that they will understand it, right? So don't make it visually so busy or orchestrally so busy that an audience can't get to the main story, right? Does the story have a primary protagonist and antagonist? And how do you make sure that the audience gets attached to the characters you want them to get attached to? And how quickly can you do that? So all of those conversations help you start building, and before long you're like, oh, well, this is exactly what the original people did, right? They just started from zero and started talking about what are the most important story elements, who's the protagonist that we want them to fall in love with and love and struggle with all the way. What are the complicated moments of the story that we're going to have to clarify and make simple so that we don't confuse the audience? What do we want them to be talking about? I mean, I usually say to the designers, what do we want the audience to be talking about after they leave the play, when they go to the bar and are like, can you believe it? That was the greatest show we ever saw. What do you want them to be surprised by and fixated on so that it stays with them? Cool. So I'll be glad to answer more in email form, etc. Later on, because I could talk about that forever.
Thank you so much, Joel. This class has been amazing. Thank you so much, young artists, for joining us for this. If we didn't get to answer your questions, don't worry. I will make sure we get answers to you as soon as we can. But we do have to wrap up at this time. Thank you all so much. Remember that DSM is a resource for you. If you have questions, send us an email. We are happy to help. We want to be here for you, especially during this time. So as much as possible, reach out, let us know. Check out our video series. We cover a lot of really great topics with a bunch of artists in the area. So that's also helpful. And hopefully we see you all next week for our conversation, Managing Hamilton, with a stage manager who was on the tour of Hamilton. It's going to be really fun, and hope to see you there. All right,
Thank
everyone.
you guys so much.
Bye.